Want to welcome everybody to another session of accurately handling the word of the truth that is found in 1 Corinthians 11, verses 20 through 22 tonight. We're going to try to accurately handle some passages here. I started on verse 20 last session, but I never got finished with it, and so we're going to start with the previous study guide that you had gotten from me previously. We're going to finish up with that. We're going to start with the second half of that sentence. The whole sentence, verse 20, says this: "When you come together, therefore, into one place, this is not to eat the Lord's Supper." And we've talked about the first half of that verse enough. I don't need to talk about it anymore, but I do want to talk about this second part that says, "This is not to eat the Lord's Supper." Literally, if you had a literal translation of that, it would say, "It is not a supper of the Lord that you eat." Okay? And of the Lord is going to be a very important part in that, because we say the Lord's Supper. And that's what it says in this verse too. It's not to eat the Lord's Supper. We'll get into why that might be a little misleading and give us the wrong idea about the Lord's Supper. Just that punctuation could be misleading. But the first thing that needs to be talked about is this little phrase, "This is not." When I look up this phrase in the original texts, you know what it says there for "this is not"? It is impossible. It is not possible. That's what it's really saying there. That's what Paul uses a lot more force than our English translations do in there, where he's saying it's impossible, it's not possible for you to be eating the supper of the Lord. And he will describe in great detail and vividness why it's not possible. But the question that needs to be asked there, if it's not possible for them to be eating the Lord's Supper, it's not possible for them to be eating the supper the way the Lord did, then whose supper are they emulating? If they're not emulating the Lord's Supper, whose supper are they emulating? Paul devotes 2 verses to describe who they're emulating, and that's in verse 21 and verse 22 that are coming up in this section here. Then, right next to that, he devotes 3 verses, which is 23 through 25, to describing how the Lord ate supper. First he says, "I'm going to describe to you how you eat supper," and then I'm going to put right next to that, I'm going to describe to you how the Lord ate supper. So that's kind of the structure that we've got for the next few verses. This is where Paul is going to compare the two and show that there's a great contrast between what they were calling the Lord's Supper and what the Lord really did. This is not to eat. Actually, to eat is just a verb. It just means eating. It's not possible that you're eating the Lord's Supper. This is something that's kind of an aside, and I'll refer to it at other times too. But we read through that and it just goes right over our head. Yeah, they were eating. Okay, so they were eating. Big deal. I want to you've got it in your notes there, and you can see it up on there, is that there was a historian. He's famous to this day in history circles. He was a Greek historian that lived during the time of Paul. During the time that Paul wrote to the 1 Corinthians, he was a historian, and apparently he was a man of means because he traveled around the Roman Empire writing about and cataloging and describing life in the Roman Empire. This was a huge treasure trove of information for us to this day. Plutarch. And so one little thing that he said, he commented among hundreds and hundreds of other things. This is what he said about the way that they were eating at that time. It says, the table manners of the participants was elbowing, snatching of food, and finger battles. It was monstrous and dog-like. Now, these are the same guys that make these beautiful statues that we just think are, this is what Rome, this is what Greek is like. No, this is what Rome and Greek was like. When they ate, it sounds like a junior high food fight. You know, doesn't it? I mean, worse than a food fight in there. And this is what was commonly accepted as the way to eat in Greco-Roman Corinth. Okay? Especially among the wealthy who could afford to throw food around. I'll refer back to that because this later on I'll get to that. But what he's talking about here is he's saying, I want to compare the way the Lord ate his supper in the upper room on the night that he was betrayed with the way you eat supper and you tell me who's of the Lord. Because they wrote to him and saying, oh, we're very spiritual people. And he heard the rest of the story from other reports other than their letters that were glowing reports of how wonderful they were doing. Yes, we're having the Lord's Supper every week. Well, yuck. Okay. Along the way. So the Lord's Supper, literally the word the Lord's Supper is of the Lord a supper. A supper that is of the Lord. That is important because the little tiny word of is a word that will take you one direction or another. If you say the Lord's Supper, you know what that leaves you thinking? That this is a supper that the Lord owns, right? If I say Gary's car, that's a car that Gary owns. This is a supper that the Lord owns. Well, in a way that is right, but it's not what Paul was trying to convey. What he was trying to convey is that this is a meal that originates from or has the same characteristics as the Lord. This is not just any supper. This is a supper that is just like the Lord is. And he goes and he spends 3 verses to describe how the Lord ate supper. Okay? But first he's going to describe how they ate supper. The Lord's Supper was to have the same characteristics that the Lord had when he originated his supper in the upper room. Okay? The Corinthian suppers originated from another source entirely, and they had the characteristics of, guess what? The Roman Empire. And they had had 1,000 years already by this time to hone this superior, this way of just grinding down on everybody they considered to be inferior, even in eating. They had a way of putting down everybody except for who they thought was of high social rank. Remember, this is a society that is very class conscious. I mean, everybody, it's always in their minds what's going on with their class, how they are coming across to their social status. All right. the characteristics of the way they were eating was what is called, and I'll get into this next slide here, a private supper. A private supper. That was actually the name of a certain kind of supper that the upper class devoured their own meal and drank their own wine, while the hungry low class have-nots had to stand there and watch. Had to stand there and watch. This was an incredibly cruel and effective way to put down those of a lower class, to humiliate them and to cause them to have to stand there hungry and watch these overfed, arrogant Roman army veterans and their families, their fat little kids and their fat old wives and stuff, just jam the food down while they had to stand and watch. That was actually a kind of supper that was accepted and approved of in Greco-Roman first century Corinth. That was this was not just a nice little fellowship dinner. Okay, that was going on. I'll talk about that some more. But the way this is said, now these are the suppers that Paul opposed. These were the suppers that were called by the by the Corinthian church the Lord's Supper. Okay, it had nothing to do with the Lord. It had everything to do with Roman power, Roman control over everybody else. And what these, yes, Paul calls these people brethren. He says, you are saved. I was there. I brought you into the kingdom. I know you're saved, but you are conforming the church to the world instead of being transformed by the renewing of your mind and forsaking the world. They doubled down on the world. They held on more tightly along the way. To eat as the Romans ate was not to eat as the Lord ate. That's what he's saying there about the Lord's Supper. All right, so now we move over to that second. I'm going to say something about the supper before we go on here. Is that supper was the main meal of the day. We could say supper or dinner. It can be leftovers or it can be a banquet. It can be anything. But a supper at that time was an evening meal that was the main meal of the day. And it had the same it had some similarities to what the Roman culture had been doing already. I mean, they didn't have restaurants. I looked it up. Restaurants didn't come into the picture, into Western culture until the 16th century. So there was no restaurants at this time, and yet that did not mean they weren't getting together to eat and socialize. They were, and it was called supper clubs. They all wanted to belong to, even slaves could belong to a supper club where they would pool their meager resources and the stuff they had filched and pilfered and away so that they could have their own little suppers together, and I can just see even the starving people just look forward to a meal together. They could eat together. And that was what was going on a lot during this time. And of course, we got this description from Plutarch of what their table manners were like, and the attitude that they came to these dinners with is that I'm here to get mine, especially among the rich. Now the slaves, they were of a different spirit entirely, because they had to be, and so, what was it? Okay, here, the accepted and proof behaviors of eating and drinking the suppers at this time in Corinth, they behaved at their dinners that they called the Lord's Supper in the same way that other Corinthians behaved at their dinners that they were having for their gods, in honor of their gods. They simply followed the socially accepted conventions of private dinners in secular and in religious Corinth. When Paul came along and said, and remember, when we get to the next verse, you'll find, or a couple of verses, he says, I delivered this to you already. I have taught you this, how you should eat together. And the supper in the upper room is the example and the model whereby you should eat together. So they already knew this, right? But they simply found it they found that if they could mix these two together and say this is the Lord's Supper when they're actually doing a Roman supper, they thought they should be commended for that. Well, Paul is going to tell them in no uncertain terms, I will not commend you for this thing. There are some things you're doing that are commendable, but this is not one of them. When it says the Lord's Supper there, this is the only time in Scriptures that a name was given to this meal. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they call it eating the Passover. Okay? Passover is a verb, but they make it into a noun and say we're eating the Passover. John is... He's a lot more simple than that. He just calls it, they ate supper. Didn't make it into the Eucharist or anything like that. They just simply called it what it was. This was a meal that they were to have together. It became known as the agape meal, okay, which means, of course, love. A feast of charity. This elbowing and food snatching and eating in front of others while they stand there hungry, there was no love in their love feasts, and Paul was not about to stand for it, and so he rebukes them soundly. Let's go on to the next verse here. Here's finally, after 4 verses, kind of like in baseball where the pitcher spends a whole lot of time getting ready for the pitch, and he winds up and he does this and he's kicking that and he's fiddling around and he's spitting and he's getting his hat and he's signaling and all this stuff. 4 verses that Paul uses for the wind up. And we've been through those 4 verses now. And he finally is going to tell us what he's so upset about. What it is that he will not praise them about. And here it is. He finally gives us the pitch. For in eating, everyone taketh before the other his own supper. And one is hungry and another is drunken. Okay? This is the bone of contention, right here. He spends 17 verses on this. He thinks this is a big deal. Look at that verse. Does that look like a very big deal to you? Well, to most people, that doesn't look like a very big deal. They go, I don't know what the big deal is. Why, and they don't even realize that verses 17 through 22 are all part of the same thing. The only thing they know is in the night that Jesus was betrayed, he took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it. That's the only thing they know about this passage here. They know 3 verses out of 17. But this is the thing that Paul, the whole reason why he writes this account of what Jesus said and what Jesus did is because of this little thing right here. First word there is for. And for just simply means because. So when it says because there, remember that verse number? That verse number is not part of Holy Spirit Scripture inspiration. That Scripture division called verse 21. That's a man-made thing. That's a man-made thing. And what they have done in their man-made way is they have disconnected verse 20 from verse 21. When Paul doesn't. See, what we've got is verse 20 that says, this is not to eat the Lord's Supper, period. Period means I'm done with that thought. And when you start with a capital on the next sentence, it means I'm starting a new thought. But not in Paul's letter it didn't. It said, this is not to eat the Lord's Supper because. It's part of the same sentence along the way. So he is not starting a new idea here. He's carrying through on the idea that it's impossible that you're eating the Lord's Supper because of this. That's the reason why it's impossible that what you call the Lord's Supper could even be anywhere close to what the Lord had in mind. Because in eating, everyone taketh before other his own supper. Okay? The rich and powerful, with their abundance of food, and the poor with no food at all, were all coming together in the church. That's what revival does. There was a revival. Paul says in other places, I'm going to stay here for a good long while because there is a great door of opportunity opened here, and there is much opposition. There was both a great opportunity open for the gospel in Corinth, and there was great opposition to Paul, to the gospel, to the things that Paul was teaching that were totally against Roman law, economics, culture, everything from relationships to all the way through their society. And so when he says to them, and they're all coming together in the church, there's these rich, and I've said before, there was these Roman citizens that had been given land so that they were representatives of Rome. Julius Caesar was the one who established Corinth. And he set out deliberately to make Corinth a little Rome. And so he populated it with Romans. Romans that were going to be loyal to the Roman way. And that's where his greatest opposition came from. Do you think his opposition came from that 80 to 90% who were freedmen and slaves? No, it came from that small minority at the top of the social standing in Corinth there. So the rich and powerful and the poor were all together in one place. The rich followed Roman culture and refused to share with the poor. That was acceptable and approved of Roman behavior. That was what, I mean, we would think that's scandalous, but we're not talking about Midwestern Minnesota in the 21st century. We're talking about an entirely different place and time. However, the flesh of man is the same regardless of when it is, and we'll find out more about what characteristics we have. Now, the next little tiny word there, I got through with for because it means because. It's not the Lord's Supper because you are doing this thing. Next word is in. In simply means, in Greek, means while or during. Does not mean in like I went into eating, okay, which is awkward for us in English there. They could have said much more clearly, during the eating. See, it was while they were eating that the problem was happening. Okay? Thing is that I find really interesting about that is that there was certain in a first century Christian gathering, there was different parts to a meeting, and a meeting would start early and it would go late. Even if you go to the Mediterranean right now, they don't have the same sense of time. They don't care so much about time. They'll stay up half the night, around a table, talking tough, telling jokes, drinking, just having a good old time. But what they would do is that they would start out the meeting with a meal. Our meetings start out with a song, right? On Sunday morning. Their meeting started in the evening with a meal. And it was during this eating time that the problems were happening. This is not the only place in Scriptures where we find out that during this fellowship meal time, there was problems. Okay, you all recall in Galatians chapter 2 where there was a division that had been simmering underneath the surface came forth and manifested itself when? During the fellowship meal. The Jews separated themselves from the Gentiles, right? That was during the eating time. Even when at the first time when the Lord was establishing this meal, what happened during the eating time of the meal in the upper room? A division that had been simmering underneath burst forth right when the Lord was establishing His supper. The supper originating with the Lord, guess what happens? Suddenly a division breaks out about who is greater. And they're arguing and accusing and putting each other down right during the eating time. Another one, Jude. He writes, 20, 30 years later than Paul writes 1 Corinthians. Jude, he accuses there of being men that were at their agape meals, their fellowship meals, who were like blemishes, like cancerous blemishes, and they would ruin the whole meal. Not only Jude says this, and he comes down really against them. He says they're going to hell. Paul calls them brethren, and he's still really patient. I can't believe how patient he is with this guy. When Paul wrote to the Thessalonians, he said, "Pray for me, brethren, that I might be delivered from unreasonable and wicked men." Well, where did he write that from when he said, "Pray for me that I might be delivered from unreasonable and wicked men"? He was in Corinth when he wrote that to the Thessalonians. Who were the unreasonable and wicked men? They were right there in the meal. They were right there in their love feasts. They were right there. And it says, Peter says the same thing. He criticizes their love meals. This isn't working. Because he says, there's those that are sporting themselves. They are reveling during your love feasts. And again, he talks about them being cancerous blemishes that ruin the whole thing for everybody. Well, this is what was going on here too. So the unreasonable and wicked men that Paul was writing about were right there, and this is what they were doing. This doesn't seem like much until you understand the culture there. So it was during the eating that the problem was taking place, and guess what? The agape meals died out and became non-existent. Some scholars, some historians say as early as 120 A.D. That's 50 years after Paul wrote here, or just a little bit more, maybe 70 years after. And some historians say that it went on for another 75 years after that. But these, we say, and this is a question I had, why don't we do agape meals? Why don't we just do the ritual of the three verses that are coming up here? In the night that Jesus was betrayed, he took bread, etc., etc. Why do we just do that part? Why don't we do the meal part? Well, I tell you, there was trouble in that meal part, and it wasn't just in Corinth. It was in other places too, that they were trying to have these love meals, and I'll describe what a love meal should have looked like here pretty soon. But you know what? There was trouble that came. That was the place where these underlying prejudices and these underlying divisions and hatreds and things came boiling out during the mealtime. It did not happen during the ritual of the cup and the bread. It came during that unstructured mealtime. And there's some reasons for that. One is that these meals, whether they were the Christian love feasts or whether they were part of the Roman thing, there was lots of drinking involved. There was lots of drinking of wine involved, which could explain a lot of things about why those prejudices came out during the meal, when they were able to keep a lid on it at other times, but the influence of alcohol in their meals loosened them up. It seems to me no wonder these meals died out. Okay? I think that this behavior was the reason why those meals died out. And there are only very small pockets of Christians throughout the world today that attempt to do the agape meal. And I'll tell you, if we could talk to them candidly, I'm sure they would tell you, it's tough. It's tough to do these because that's where this stuff, trouble comes out there, in those places. All right, so while they're eating, and of course the eating, these meals had 4 different parts to them. Let's go on here. There they are, the meal. They were eating, had several stages. The breaking of bread, here's what would begin the meal, is that somebody in the assembly, some leader, the shepherd of the church or whoever, would stand up with a loaf of bread and would tear it in two and give thanks to the Lord for it. Hush everybody down, get them hushed down, give thanks just like we would before we're going to ask a blessing on a pot blessed meal or something like that. Somebody gets but what they would do is that they would then, that he would give a chunk to this guy and this guy, and they would just take, and they would give a piece to everybody that was there. That was the signal that the meal was to begin. That was the meal, so that what it did is that it put everything, it was intended to put everything that happened for the whole evening under the Lord, under thanksgiving to the Lord. So they all got a little piece of bread, okay? If you're a starving freedman, that ain't the meal. Okay? That's just a little token that the meal's begun. The second part of that meal is the agape meal. And that was a full-blown meal. Thing about it is that when we get further into this, it'll say, every one of you eats his own supper. Well, that is a key to this thing, is that we think, own supper, okay, fine, we all eat our own supper, we got our own plate and everything. That word, own, means something very, very important in there, having to do, and I'll get to it, I'm just getting ahead of myself. Then there was, when the meal was coming to an end, it was winding down. During that meal, there was, and Paul makes a big point of saying this all through this, is that he never says, you're just eating. No, he says you're eating and drinking. Eating and drinking. Okay, so there's alcohol here. I don't think they were just drinking water, especially because these people were bringing their own meals with them. Say, when we go to a potluck, everybody brings something, but you don't bring your whole meal, sit down at a table and say, this is my meal. I don't know what you brought, but this is mine. Along the way, they did. They did. That was an accepted way of doing this meal. Now, when the meal was winding down, then a leader, or most likely the shepherd, would introduce the cup of blessing. And the cup of blessing was not just the cup, but it was also bread. And this was when the ritual that was done regularly, as often as you do it, as Paul says, as often as you do it, you do this often. This is the ritual that began, that continues on to this day, is what's called the cup of blessing. And he talks about the cup of blessing and the bread of communion in the previous chapter quite a bit. So this is where a cup of wine, or what they did is they had a common cup. They had usually a large bowl, and everybody drank from that same bowl. They were not as conscious. They were not germ conscious like we were. I mean, most of the world is not there. I mean, they think we're... but that's when the bread would be done. But see, the thing is that in theirs, the wine was taken first. Then the bread. When Paul writes this down, he puts the bread first and then the wine. Okay. He says he got it from the Lord. But that wasn't the normal way of doing it from way back in Jewish times. No, the wine came first. The breaking of bread came later. But this is switched around in there. Then after that part is done, that is supposed to be the very spiritual part. It's supposed to be this part where the unity of the Spirit is built. When that part is over, then they would automatically, right where they were sitting, right in the assembly hall there that they were eating in, or in especially the houses that were in, they would stay right where they were, and they would enter into a worship service. And that's where chapters 12, 13, and 14 come in. See, there's a progression here from chapter 11, where it first talks about appearances in a public meeting, then it talks about how you eat together in a public meeting, and then for 12, 13, and 14, it talks about how you worship together in a public meeting. There's a progression that goes all the way through that, and we see that in their meals, that it starts out with a meal, but it ends up in worship and ministry and the gifts of the Spirit. Just an asides there, because there was so much drinking that was going on in these what's called private meals, it may explain at least some of the outrageous abuse of speaking in tongues that was done by them. Just a thought there. Now, the next word there that needs to be unpacked is everyone. It says, everyone. In eating or during the eating, everyone takes before their own supper. Now, not everyone was doing this. It says everyone there, but that's not a good translation there, because the word there is, and I'm not going to tell you what the Greek word is, but the word there does not mean everyone that's present. It means individuals. Individuals. So what it is saying is that while you're eating, individuals are taking before their own supper. Because if everybody was taking their own meal and eating their own supper, there wouldn't be anybody hungry, according to verse 22. It says, and there's those that are hungry, and then it goes on to say later on, you shame those that have nothing. If everybody got to eat, if everyone was taking their own meal, then no one would be hungry. There wouldn't be any hunger, and there wouldn't be any shame. Okay? But in fact, there was hunger and there was shame, and that means that not everybody was doing this thing. It was only the rich and the powerful and those that thought themselves to be superior because they had the money to back it up. And they had the authority of Rome to back it up too, which is no small thing then. So everyone does not mean everyone there. Here's the biggest word of all. Taketh before the other. taketh before the other. I have made the statement here that an accurate interpretation of this entire section, this whole section on the Lord's Supper, depends upon what Paul really said when he used the words, taketh before other. Now, the Greek word that is broken down into 3 English words there's only one Greek word, even though it is a compound word. It is the word prolambano. You don't need to remember that, except that the first part of that word is pro. Pro means in front of, or it can mean before. Okay? Before, now this might seem a little elementary, but it needs to be said. Before can mean 2 different things. Before can mean that it's the time prior to something else. Okay? If I show up at church before Mary does, that means I showed up prior in time to Mary. Okay? However, before can also mean the location of something in the presence of something else. If I appear before a judge and jury, that doesn't mean that I showed up before they did, even though I use the same word. When I show up before a judge and jury, that doesn't mean they're late and I'm early. That means I showed up in the presence of the judge and jury. And that is the different ways that this pro part is interpreted. Now, Paul has already said, I will not praise you for your behavior. You're not going to get any commendation from me. If some were simply eating prior to others at these meals, and there would be, and some were eating later, what's the big deal? What's the big deal? There would be no one that would be hungry, and no one would be shamed just because they ate later than someone else. See? But as I looked in, and I've got it written down here. I think I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. About 7 different English translations of this word taketh before, and they all say that it's one person eating prior to another. But if one person eats prior to another, everybody would eat, right? One person would just eat earlier than the other person, but there would be nobody that was hungry. And yet there was people that were hungry. There would be no shame if you ate later than somebody else. You still got to eat. There would be no shame. Maybe you had to work late. The freedmen were working night and day just to survive. If they came later than the rich guy who had all day, there's no shame in that. He just comes when he can. But there is shame and there is hunger. Therefore, it cannot mean that it's prior to, that they ate prior to. It means that they were eating in front of, in the presence of. Okay? And there's where the hunger came, is that they weren't to offer anything. you've seen the mob boss movies, you've seen the noir movies where you got the big fat mob boss sitting in the restaurant that he owns, eating this big fat meal, and he's got it running down his face and his fingers and everything, and all his goons are standing around. Not one bit is given to them. And then they drag in the guy who owes money to him, and they kick him in the back of the knees. He falls down his knees, and then that guy's got to watch this guy as he eats and takes his time and slobbers and rubs it in and says, this is so good. And he gets none. Okay? Now, the guy who's on his knees, he may have had a good meal that day, but these slaves and these freedmen didn't. They didn't. And so that's, and these movies that we see, they're just caricatures of something that was actually going on, started in the Roman culture, started in the Greek culture back then. And so that's the kind of thing that was going on there. It was cruel and it was cowardly. It was... So let me get on to the next part of this word here. The second part of the Greek word pro-lambano is lambano. And so pro means eating in the presence of. Pro means in front of. In front of is what it means. You are eating in front of. Lambano, here's what I was getting at. Here's what lambano means. This is Paul. It means to take for one. There's 4 different ways you can look at lambano according to the Greek dictionaries. To take for oneself, to seize by force, to devour, and to control. And of course we have the quote from Plutarch that I've already done there, is that eating for them was these monstrous and dog-like elbowing, snatching, finger battles. Another scholar that many of you might know already is A.T. Robertson. You probably have heard of him. He's a scholar of first century New Testament and culture at that time. He calls it was a grab game. And that's about as technical. I mean, this guy's a very sophisticated British guy, and he says the only way I can describe the way they were doing this is it was a grab game, and this is this dog-like devouring and grabbing and seizing of food while others stand there starving. So which one of the Labanos, take for yourself, seize by force, devour, or to control, is the one that Paul means? What were these people doing? They were seizing by force. They were taken for themselves alone. They were doing all four of those. They devour. It wasn't a polite little meal where everybody was just sitting quietly and enjoying each other's company. This was a calculated plan to put down and humiliate others and to raise yourself up, to prove that you were superior to everybody else. It was a grab game. To think of the rich simply came prior to the poor and quietly ate their supper is to ignore the facts. That there was people, the majority of them were hungry, and the majority of them were shamed and humiliated deeply because they had to stand in the presence of these people who were overfed and grabbing for more. That's what Paul was so upset about. This is the big deal. He says, how could you twist things around so badly to say that what you're doing is the Lord's Supper? But that's what they were doing. They had written to him and said, we're observing the Lord's Supper and it is wonderful. Well, see, when Stephanus and Fortunatus and Achaicus came and delivered that wonderful glowing letter to Paul when he was in Ephesus, they told Paul the rest of the story. They didn't just give him the letter, but said, we're doing great. In fact, we're doing better than you are, Paul. You should take a lesson from us. And they told him the rest of the story. Okay. So then Paul wrote his rebuke, which is the letter that we have, and sent it back with these three guys. Okay. That's significant. When by the time we get there, that will be more, mean something along the way. Now, the next phrase here, which is a rail switch phrase, is his own supper. Everyone, or it's not everyone, it says particular individuals were grabbing and devouring and seizing food by force in the front of others. In other words, he was taking his own meal. Now, to most readers, they go, so what? The word own there is idios. It means private or separate. That's what the word own there means. Certain individuals were seizing upon and devouring their own private supper. Their own private supper. Different kinds of suppers in Rome. Remember, they had no restaurants, okay? When you say, let's go out, okay? So then they say, well, where do you want to go? We can go to fast food, or we can go to, a swanky sit-down restaurant. We can go all kinds of ways. Well, Roman culture had the same thing. They didn't have any restaurants, but they had different kinds of suppers. And they had names for those things, just like we have names for all of our different styles of food. What you get at TGI Fridays is going to be different than what you get at New China. So they had free suppers. I'm not going to go into detail on what these all are, just a couple. There was free suppers, there was meat privilege suppers, which means the higher your status, the better meat you got. Okay. Equal parts suppers, subscription suppers, portion suppers, common table suppers, and private suppers. I underline that one because private suppers is the actual name of a certain kind of supper that was common in Greco-Roman culture. That was big thing in Corinth. What happened at a private supper? Okay, let's see. Private suppers. Look at this. I'm going to see if I can get on the same page in my notes here. A private suppers were when the invited guests brought their own meal with them and proceeded to eat it all themselves in the presence of the other guests. Okay. Now, to be invited to a supper was to increase your status. You gained honor that way. To host a supper like this gave you twice the honor and high status for doing this. So what they would do is they'd invite a bunch of their guests. And who were they going to invite? People of high status that could build up their status. They could make connections. They could get people that owe them favors in close proximity to them, and just corruption in general going on there. But this was a meal where everybody brought their own meal and they ate it themselves. They did not share their meal with everybody else. So I sit down at the table and I have my meal, and I have my slaves carry in all the food, and don't forget the wine, and they bring it all in and they serve me this stuff. And he sits there and he eats, and possibly his family is with him or something like that. And this guy over here, he's got the same thing. He's got slaves bringing in stuff, and they load down his table, and he sits there and he eats, and he yells across and he says, "What do you got?" And the other guy says, "Oh, I got this. You got nothing like I got. I got something. This is straight out of Afghanistan, or whatever. This is a peacock, or whatever they would do." And they would boast between each other to raise their status. And this is how honor was won. And this is how you could progress up the ladder of success in their culture along the way. This is the way they would do that. The slaves never got any of it. Now so when the church was young in Corinth, everybody would show up for these meals. Man, I tell you, the freedmen and the slaves, they would say, "Hot dog, 1 meal a week. It's Fat Sunday, I'm going to eat." And they would come, and they would wait, and they would watch, and they would watch all these opulent meals going on around them. Nobody shared anything with them. They didn't get anything. But they got one thing out of it. They got humiliated. They got humiliated out of. Personally, I think that is because of private dinners being done in the name of the Lord's Supper that caused, not only in Corinth, but all around in the different places where the apostles report that there was trouble in these meals, of different kinds of troubles that rose out of these meals, that I believe that is because of private suppers where you brought your own food, you ate it yourself, and you gloried in it, and you left everybody hungry and humiliated, that they died out. Who would come after a while? After a year, after 2 years, after 5 years, after 10 years of coming to the Sunday night meeting, who would come for the agape meal except for the rich and famous who could compete with each other for how well they're doing? How well they're doing. If I was a slave and I wasn't required to be there, do you think I'd keep coming? Would you keep coming? If you were a freedman and you didn't owe somebody at the agape meal a favor, would you show up? You might have to show up and endure the humiliation while your stomach growls, waiting for the worship service to begin. You know what I'd do? I wouldn't show up then. You know what I'd show up for? I'd show up for the time. I just time it so that I could come in just as they're offering the cup and the bread. This is my body given for you. This is my blood for of the new covenant. That's when I would show up, and then I would stay for the meeting. I would not come to the agape because there was no agape in the agape meals. There was nothing. And I think that Paul goes on through this whole section to say how you should do an agape meal and the attitude you should do in the agape meal. But you know what? We don't do it very often anymore. That's I just got the nod. Yeah, I should have been watching the clock. So thanks for listening, and we'll take it up there